Yentl will be presenting on Queering the Gaps, Sappho's Poetry as an Instrument for Change from Victorian to Contemporary Culture. Yentl Love is a doctoral student at the University of Potsdam, Germany, who is researching the Roman worship of Bacchus through the lens of queer theory. She has taught and presented on the intersections between queerness and the ancient world, particularly in the context of gender nonconformity in ancient religion and queer receptions of antiquity. Her current research is focused on exploring queer ecology and eco-criticism and the relationship between queerness and the liminal space. A researcher after my own heart, I must say. So thank you so much, Yentl. We are very happy to have you.
Okay, I will just share my screen with you all. Okay, so thank you all for being here. Thank you very much for that introduction. As was just said, my name is Yentl Love. I'm a PhD student from the University of Potsdam, Germany, and I'm really excited to be here with you all today to discuss the reception of Sappho. So this paper has come from a personal interest of mine in both the life, but particularly the reception of Sappho, and how we can see this in all different forms of political discourse where we might not expect to see her as an influence. I'm going to talk about this with you this afternoon, looking at how Sappho and her poetry has been used as an instrument of political change. And I'm going to do this through a process I'm going to call queering the gaps, or looking at how the blank spaces in her works have contributed to this use as an instrument. And then I will finish by just sharing some concluding thoughts with you all. So, to quickly introduce the historical figure of Sappho, for those of you who don't know, she was a poet writing in the 7th to 6th century BCE, and she's mainly known for her descriptions of kind of erotic love between women. She came from the Greek island of Lesbos, which is where we get our word lesbian from, as well as the word sapphic from Sappho. One of the key issues with Sappho's poetry and our modern understanding of her, however, is that most of her work has been lost. Out of an estimated 10,000 lines of poetry, only about 650 survive. And we also see very large gaps, or what's called lacunae, in the poems themselves, which I will focus on later in this presentation. And because of this, a lot of what is believed about Sappho's life comes from kind of educated guesses or inventions based on the scholarship, the culture, and the politics of the time in which people are writing about Sappho, leading a historian called Ellen Green to say that each generation invents its own Sappho. So, moving on to our discussion of the use of Sappho across time. In the Victorian era, we largely see this idea of Sappho as a schoolmistress, which has generally been considered a sort of homophobic response to the queerness of Sappho's work by reducing her poetry to a desexualized relationship between a teacher and a student. This arguably is quite a reductive interpretation of a far more complicated relationship between society, politics, and Sappho, particularly in the context of female poets of the Victorian era. And although the poems are often straightwashed, as we might call it, her poems are still used as a vehicle of change to disrupt the social and the political status quo. Throughout the Victorian period, Sappho was often identified as a fallen woman through her explicit depiction of sexual desire, deemed inappropriate for a woman, even despite this straightwashing. A key example of this is in Mary Catherine Hume Rothery's 1862 poem entitled Sappho, in which she used the figure of Sappho as a commentary on the political kind of feminist movement around women's rights. She used this characterization of Sappho as a fallen woman, so a woman with kind of inappropriate sexuality, often connected to sex workers, to comment on the radical political discourse of the period in which middle-class women began to identify across class lines with women of the working class, recognizing that that circumstance was the largest driver of so-called kind of inappropriate sexuality. And Sappho then is used as a figurehead, representing the need for a cross-class feminism. We also see Sappho used to further advance social change in the works of self-proclaimed Victorian feminist Catherine Dawson, who actually called herself the Sappho of this age. And in Dawson's book, innovatively titled Sappho, she drew on the tradition of Sappho as a school teacher to portray the poet as a feminist educational activist, founding a school for women and combating the subjugation of women, revealing through her work the truth of women's academic abilities. And therefore, while the deliberate kind of historical erasure of any homoeroticism in Sappho's poetry may certainly still be condemned, it is important to note that Sappho's poetry still remains a vehicle for political change. Even while homoeroticism may be erased, Sappho's explicit discussion of sexual desire still resulted in this portrayal as a kind of deviant or a fallen woman, while her literary fame and alleged involvement in schooling characterized her as an academically capable figure of aspiration for many women. So even though we do see this straightwashing, Sappho remains a key figurehead for political change in the Victorian era, becoming a model for women's rights across kind of class boundaries. 100 years later, Sappho again emerges as a figure in the fight for women's rights, this time in the case of lesbian and queer women, who embraced Sappho as a collective ancestor. During the late 20th century, lesbian and queer rights activists sought to use Sappho as evidence for the long history of female same-sex attraction, and through this kind of validating their own identities. They compared this alleged school of Sapphos on Lesbos with the so-called lesbian ghettos, which emerged in Paris in their 19th and 20th centuries. This connection between Sappho and lesbian activism is similarly demonstrated in the queer female group Daughters of Bilitis, who modelled themselves after a fictional lover of Sappho. Alongside this suggestive name, the Daughters of Bilitis adopted Sappho as a legitimizer of female homoerotic desire, including her within the pages of their newsletter, The Ladder, as an honorary member of their community, a historical ancestor, and the figurehead of the column of their readers' own poetry. For a community that is used to erasure and denial alongside more typical kind of homophobic prejudice, Sappho became a tool with which to validate lesbian sexuality, acting as this exemplified model of queer female sexuality in history, with an additional benefit of being an accomplished and sort of respectable figure. And we can see the importance of Sappho as a tool with which to validate lesbian sexuality in books such as Sappho Was a Right-on Woman, which is a 1972 manifesto by self-identified feminist and lesbian authors Abbott and Love on the acceptance and the existence of lesbian and queer women across history. And while Sappho is actually only mentioned once in this book, the title shows how she really became a figurehead for lesbian and queer women to rally behind, providing a historic ancestor and a political tool for their own validation and the fight for equal rights. A further radical potential for the reception of Sappho emerges through the works of the African-American poet Harriet Mullen, who transformed Sappho into the character Sapphire, which was a popular kind of derogatory term for Black women at the time. Mullen brings together lyric poetry and the blues, using Sappho or sapphire as a symbol of defiance against the misogynoir that sought to demean Black women, both in the literary and artistic community and in wider society. And we see this particularly in Mullen's poem Muse and Drudge, in which the voices of Sappho, the lyric poet, and Sapphire, the Black woman who refuses to be silenced, are brought together to justify and validate the poetic abilities of Mullen's Sapphire and the Black women that she represents. Even the styling of Mullen's poetry is designed to evoke Sappho, with the repeated personal pronouns acting as a representation of Sappho's own narrative style. So each I is intended to represent not just Mullen, but equally reflect Sappho herself. And through this, Mullen arguably grants her own poems the same status as that of this predominant celebrated white female voice of poetry, using an adaptation of Sappho and her poems to make a statement about the misogynoir targeted towards Black women in the contemporary literary and artistic community. A final aspect of the reimagination and manipulation of Sappho's image to evoke cultural change may be seen in the works of beatnik poet Ed Sanders, who employed the ghost of Sappho as a kind of countercultural figure throughout his long narrative poems, including the famous Sappho on East 7th. The Sappho in Sanders' poetic collection is seen to embody a countercultural reading, bringing this beatnik bohemian social agenda of prioritizing pleasure, art, and the feminine above repressive social structures, militarism, and the patriarchy. In Sappho on East 7th, the ghost of Sappho reveals herself to the narrator, teaching him how best to sexually satisfy women, in a reflection both of the contemporary approach to Sappho's sexuality and to the developing countercultural movement of free love in 1960s America. Sanders' modern Sappho is therefore used to convey this countercultural sexual revolution of the 1960s, in which the invention of the pill and the celebration of sexual freedom ushered in a new age of female sexuality and pleasure, all of which Sanders' Sappho represents. We also see a really radical interpretation of Sappho's use as a tool for political change in his Ode to Sappho, where Sanders makes use of specific aspects of Sappho's poetry to paint her as a model of the pacifist anti-imperialist movement. And you can see this here in this excerpt from Sanders' Ode to Sappho, where he talks about Sappho as a model for pacifism, saying that unlike other poets who are kind of fascinated with war and warlike aspects, Sappho rejects this. Instead, you find these themes of love, tenderness, family, partying, arousal, longing, sadness, and fun. And this particular interpretation is based on a fragment of Sappho's, fragment 16, where she writes that some say a force of horsemen, some say infantry, others say a fleet of ships is the loveliest thing on the dark earth, but I say it is the one you love. So prioritizing love and affection over this kind of army, military, naval kind of power. This idea of prioritizing love over militarism was a very attractive model for Sanders to build his own Sappho upon, using her as a countercultural figure advocating for pacifism over American militarism. And Sappho then becomes a tool with which to advance the politics of the beatnik movement, being a representative of free love and empowered sexuality, but also pacifist ideals. Now, I want to briefly compare this with some theory, beginning with the fictional novel The Pisces, which is written by Melissa Broder. In this novel, the central character is writing a thesis on the works of Sappho, hypothesizing that the lacunae, or the gaps, within her poetry should be considered a fundamental aspect of the poems themselves, rather than simply an absence of missing text. The unknown of these blank spaces, Broda's heroine suggests, is impossible for us to discover, and is arguably then more successfully viewed as a form of text themselves, imagining them instead as kind of an intentional inclusion by Sappho herself, instead of trying to fill the gaps with our own estimations. Through this, the character suggests, the reader may distance themselves from the idea of a first-person narrative, and thus knowing the author, which could remove speculation over the identity or indeed the sexuality of Sappho, instead considering the blank spaces and the missing parts as an intrinsic part of the author's identity. Sappho herself is the missing. This quote by Hedano, I think, really sums up the alternative option that Broda's heroine is so against. The fact that through our own reading, the fragmented nature of these texts unlocks a whole group of different meanings in which there are multiple unique readings which are all as valid as each other. When this approach to kind of fragmented poetic remains is combined with the first-person narrative style of much of Sappho's poetry, the reader's own assumptions of the gaps become naturally assumptions of Sappho. Thus, as one person reads their own queer experiences in the missing spaces of a fragment, so too for them does Sappho become queer. The idea of this reinvention and reimagination based on the missing spaces in Sappho's poetry may arguably be linked to the theory The Death of the Author, in which it is suggested that the meaning of the book is created by the reader, which kind of necessitates a metaphorical death of the author. And through this approach, a reader's own interpretation is prioritized rather than kind of privileging the author's intended meaning, resulting in countless valid interpretations of the same text. If we apply this to Sappho's text, each reader's own interpretation of Sappho's poetry is kind of equally valid, with the author herself removed from the equation. And the fragmentation of Sappho's poetry arguably develops this even further. The substantial gaps throughout the poems leave increased space for individual interpretation as readers find themselves attempting to fill in the blanks. And through the first-person narrative style of Sappho's poetry, these assumptions are further extended to the author herself, with little separation considered between the narrator and the author. And therefore, the blank spaces in Sappho's poetry directly impact our own reinvention of her. They enable a kind of deeper reimagination, and the death of Sappho the author occurs kind of in favor of the Sappho figure of our own poetic invention. To conclude, I would like to return to the Ellen Green quote from the start of this paper. Each generation invents its own Sappho. As we have seen, the blank spaces and the kind of missing aspects of the narrative poems written by the historic figure of Sappho have left spaces to fit in our own imaginings within the gaps. As Broda's heroine writes of Sapphic scholarship, readers have been keen to avoid this unknowing through inserting their own narratives and imaginations of Sappho's biography into the blank spaces in her work. And it's this ability to shape the first-person narrative of the poems throughout the missing fragments that has enabled Sappho to be used as an instrument for radical emancipation and social change. While the proposal of Broda's heroine to view the gaps as intentional is an unlikely approach that the character herself later rejects, what remains true is that the blank spaces have become intrinsic not only to our interpretation of Sappho's poetry, but to our imagining of the poetess herself. Arguably, it is the fragmentation and the poetic absences which have enabled the death of Sappho as author and historical figure, instead encouraging her use as this figurehead for varied political motivations. And because of this, through history, we see a queering of these gaps in both our knowledge of Sappho and of her poems, which transforms her into a vehicle for a varied political and historical reception through the lens of literary form. Each individual has brought what they themselves are seeking to the fragmented works of Sappho, whether a voice against imperialism and the Vietnam War, a proponent of female education and queer sexuality, or a foil against which to protest racism within the artistic community and society as a whole. Arguably, then, it is not that each generation invents its own Sappho, but rather each reader invents their own Sappho. The unknowing intrinsic to Sappho and her poetry has resulted in her eternal reimagination, becoming the perpetual countercultural figure that each of us imagined she could be. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I look forward to any questions. And there is my email here on the slide if you want to get in contact with me after this. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was such a lovely presentation. We do have a question in chat to start with. So you brought up a couple of times the different sorts of countercultural movements that Sappho winds up being called on. Do you feel like there is any kind of sort of atomization where she gets taken out of context to be put into those different views, or is it a part of her initial countercultural feeling of that queerness that she exhibits already is that gender change, that sexuality difference that we perceive always in a part of that movement?
I think it's really interesting because she is throughout all of these different kind of interpretations of Sappho, what remains the same is that she is generally kind of othered in a way. She's put on the sidelines, whether that's because she is a woman writing in a time that mostly men are writing, or because of the fact that she talks openly about sexuality and desire, or potentially this kind of homoeroticism that we now associate with her. Whatever the kind of defining aspect of her, she is always countercultural. She always appears kind of against the norm, which is a string that really kind of revolves around it. And so although you do see contradicting kind of uses of her, particularly in some of the Victorian poets that I mentioned, these female poets will talk about her as being quite kind of sexually open. They will refer to that as in relationships with men, which is a direct contrast to her use in like with the Daughters of Bilitis, where they very much kind of celebrate her as a queer ancestor. But what kind of draws them both together is that even though they're talking about sexuality in terms of attraction to men versus attraction to women, it's still what is considered an unacceptable female sexuality at the time. And it's that kind of draws them together. One of the ways, though, in which you do see quite a stark difference is in poets and authors like Harriet Mullen talked a lot about how Sappho was used and kind of reclaimed by the groups like the Daughters of Bilitis, and they celebrated her as this ancestor. But one of the reasons that they liked to use her was because she looked like the perfect lesbian that they wanted, and they encouraged their readers to kind of be like Sappho, to still wear feminine clothing, to not look too masculine, to not go against these norms. And their group was predominantly white. And so then we see a lot of people like how Harriet Mullen kind of changes Sappho into Sapphire, who then comment on this kind of erasure of African-American, Black and people of color in the LGBT community, and especially within the community of queer women, and kind of comment on the fact that they're celebrating Sappho, and when they're doing this, they are erasing the voices of people of color. So that's one aspect that I can think of in which we do see kind of a contrasting opinion that isn't as that doesn't have the similarities of like, oh, but you're still cross-cultural. That is a very much, we don't like how you're using this figure. And yeah.
Yeah, I'm especially interested in Sappho as a voice for counterculture in an adaptation into movements that would not have been relevant for her, right? Like within her time, certainly we have, we have a lot of evidence for ancient Greek misogyny, but she's also known as the 10th muse, right? So, so a lot of these countercultural understandings of her, and particularly in ones that made no sense at the time, like, certainly the ancient Greeks were aware of and had different things to say about colors of skin, but the idea of an African American wouldn't have made any sense. The idea of being inherently anti-war, as the Beatniks and the free love movement turned out to be, would have made very little sense. So I'm interested in sort of that perspective. What do you think we can draw on from her use in those contexts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so fascinating, and especially because, like you said, I don't think there would have been that direct parallel. You know, the fragment that Ed Sanders is talking about, although people have said it does look like it's a contrast to Homer, and when Homer is talking about in his Iliad, all of these kind of war-like peoples coming together to fight, is not, you know, as much of this is not a statement of pacifism, or that's what scholars tend to think. That isn't how it would have been recognized at all. But I think that part of the reason that Sappho is able to become all of these figures is because we know so little about her. All of her life really is kind of a mystery. We piece together some things. We think she might have been from, you know, a relatively wealthy family. I think she might have had a brother that was across the sea. You know, we get little bits and pieces of her story, but because of all of the gaps, and because of the fact that, you know, like 95% of her work has been completely lost to us forever, we just don't really know anything about her other than the fact that she was incredibly talented and was seen, as you said, as this 10th muse, and the fact that she has we have these like little snippets that can very easily be employed as kind of metaphors, and as like the center and the heart of political movements, which they might have been separated from, but because all of the context around them is lost, it's very easy to apply them to any particular situation. And so I think that is why we see Sappho emerging so much, because, you know, we know that she is brilliant. We know that her poems are beautiful. We know that they resonate with us as we read them, just like, you know, all good poetry does. We know it has that kind of personal resonance. And yet we don't know so much that we can use her wherever we want to, really.
Right. So when it comes to Sappho in the modern age, because you've talked a lot about sort of the very sort of momentous social change aspects that she's associated with, and she is, at least in English, intrinsically a part of the lesbian and sapphic. Those words are part of our lexicon. That's where they come from. That's what they derive from. So we cannot talk about women loving women or femmes loving femmes without discussing Sappho. So where do you see that showing up now?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true. I mean, if you ever go on, you know, the queer spaces of Tumblr, particularly, you know, the lesbian spaces, you will see Sappho being talked about now. There's a very famous poem of Sappho's that says, "Sweet mother, I cannot weave, for Aphrodite has kind of struck me with longing for a girl." And people will be kind of reposting this, saying, you know, oh, I'm a useless lesbian, like Sappho started it. She's very much still seen in kind of the online young people as this kind of idealized figure of female desire. And I think that it's only really in the last sort of 5 years or so that we've seen kind of a revolution in terms of overt female queer representations on our screens, in our media, in our music. You know, I'm only 26, and this all wasn't around when I was young, let alone for people that are, you know, in their middle ages, in their old ages, you know. So this is a very new thing, the popularity of kind of, and the acceptability of all of these different queer female icons that we have now. And so I think Sappho has always been this person that people can look back to, and you can, yeah, the popularity of her within the online sphere, particularly in, you know, young girls, young femmes, young people that identify with the queer kind of umbrella and the sapphic umbrella. They see her and they see her poems and they see themselves in them in a very, very powerful way. And yeah, I think it's nice to, when you see yourself in history, you can then imagine your future. And so I think she is, yeah, has still become and still is this kind of ancestor that people see their own lives and their own experiences reflected in.
Well, thank you so much. This is a topic that I personally am very fond of. I was writing my dissertation on Sappho and her uh, Proto-Indo-European and Semitic influences
Wow, that
when
sounds amazing.
back when I was attempting to do that before the pandemic. So thank you very much for happening to choose this paper because I absolutely adore this work. And thank you to our audience for your thoughtful questions. Um, Yentl, what a lovely presentation, and it's
Thank you
been
so
such a
much.
nice time talking to you.
Thank you.